how dare you white-splain to me? How dare you mansplain to me? What do you know? And so on.
Douglas Murray has once again demonstrated his sharp intellect and...
Douglas Murray and Brianna Joy Gray engage in a significant debate about Hamas and its charter. Their discussion dives deeply into the complex nature of Hamas, the implications of its charter, and broader issues related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Here is a detailed exploration of their arguments and the issues at hand.
Now let's talk about the Hamas-Israeli war, the US-backed ceasefire proposal. The negotiations there are continuing. Hamas has sent back an unworkable counteroffer. Even the US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken acknowledges that the war's going to go on with that unworkable counter from Hamas. They're refusing to agree to a plan that would include the release of hostages in exchange for a ceasefire. But it's worth noting, Douglas, that the Biden administration has the likes of National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, who has said some of the amendments proposed by Hamas are minor and anticipated. It's almost like he's negotiating on their behalf. So much for not negotiating with terrorists. It seems the Biden administration has some who are negotiating on behalf of terrorists.
Well, I find this latest round of peace talks to be an extraordinary set of events. Israel is trying to get the remaining hostages back. It performed, or the IDF performed, Special Forces performed an extraordinarily impressive raid this past week in which they rescued four of the poor Israelis who were stolen from the Nova party on the 7th of October last year and have been tortured and more in captivity all the last 8 months. So the Israelis want to find a way, of course, to get the hostages back. With the Americans and other interlocutors, they've got this plan, and this plan would bring an end to the war. Now, who is the party that refuses to bring an end to the war? It's Hamas. And I wonder, Rita, whether all the morons protesting on the streets of Australia and America and everywhere else in the West, calling for ceasefire, will register for even a moment that a ceasefire actually is on the table once again. And who is it that has rejected it? Hamas. And you know, I wonder whether any of these morons will notice this. I doubt it. But if the war is going to go on, everybody can say now with 100% certainty, as you could for the last 8 months, the reason that there is no ceasefire is because of Hamas.
Absolutely. Well, the morons, as you call them, marching in the streets in Australia, they never mention Hamas. It's always like Hamas don't exist. Yep. And you are going to be involved in a debate next week where you will argue that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Tell me why you think that is the case, because there are many on the left in particular who argue that being anti-Israel, being anti-Zionist is not the same as being anti-Semitic. And they point often to the fact that there are prominent Jews who call themselves anti-Zionists.
Yeah, I'm going to keep my powder dry for Toronto on Monday night. But it's
not giving it away.
I'm not giving anything away. I mean, it's a topic that's incredibly important because just look at the way in which this word Zionist is now thrown around. I mean,
Douglas Murray argues that Hamas is unequivocally a terrorist organization. His argument is grounded in the content of the Hamas Charter, which he cites as evidence of the group's extreme objectives. According to Murray, the Charter explicitly calls for the destruction of Israel and the killing of Jews. He views this Charter as a clear indication of Hamas's intentions and motivations. Murray points out that the Charter's language is uncompromising and hostile, revealing an agenda that goes beyond political conflict to include ideological and religious extremism.
Sky News All-Star Douglas Murray has been a vocal critic of Hamas since the terror group launched their assault on Israel on October 7th last year. The outspoken commentator has continued his tirade into the new year, publicly blasting individuals and organisations who he sees as supporting Hamas. Conservative commentator Douglas Murray has consistently slammed Hamas and supporters of Palestine since the war broke out on October 7, 2023. Mr. Murray has made a point of highlighting the radical aspects of Hamas and how this terror organisation is different to anything we've ever experienced.
Hamas targeted innocent civilians in Israel on October the 7th. And it's a pretty unique terror organization, Hamas, or an unusual one, because yes, it then wishes to use any innocent civilians in Gaza as collateral to their, or indeed the main attack point for their war. No other, I can't think of an army that has behaved like this in history, which is one of the reasons why Hamas is not an army. It's a terror group. It literally puts civilians in front of its own terrorists. It literally puts civilian buildings above its own terrorist infrastructure, its weapons storage units, its missile storage, and indeed its leaders. This is a sort of cowardly way in which Hamas acts.
Douglas Murray has also engaged in many heated arguments with commentators who push a pro-Palestine agenda.
First of all, your other guest, I don't know what kind of a creature he is. He's a kind of low-grade thug as far as I can see. He's listened to nothing I've said.
Yeah, I know, because I'm Muslim. That's what you call all Muslims.
I'll tell you. No, it's not that at all. It's not that at all. I just think that you're just a very low-rent racist. But anyway, let me just get on to it. You say first of all, I don't care about the death of Palestinian children. Yes, I do care. I care very deeply about it. But I also know that the responsibility for their deaths lies on Hamas, which has misgoverned their society for the last 16 years and now has been leading the country into being in a war with Israel. So yes, it's on Hamas this.
Douglas Murray vehemently denies Palestinians are victims of genocide, slamming anyone who pushes this idea.
Well, anyone who uses the term genocide in this context simply doesn't know what they're talking about or is a malevolent actor. I don't know if Mr. Week has travelled at all in his life, how far he's travelled, how many conflicts he's seen, but I'd have guessed none. And you clearly know nothing about this particular conflict, and you've obviously seen none of it.
He doubles down on his support for Israel, saying the IDF do everything in their power to avoid civilians.
Murray emphasises that the nature of Hamas's violence and rhetoric aligns with terrorist activities. He notes that Hamas has carried out numerous attacks against civilians, including rocket strikes targeting Israeli cities. Murray argues that such actions are not merely military operations, but are intended to instill fear and cause maximum harm. He believes that this pattern of behaviour fits the definition of terrorism, which involves the use of violence to achieve political or ideological goals. In contrast, Brianna Joy Gray offers a different perspective on Hamas. She argues that Hamas should not be classified as a terrorist organisation, but rather as a resistance movement. Gray contends that Hamas is fighting for the rights of Palestinians who are under occupation. She emphasises that the violence attributed to Hamas is a reaction to the Israeli occupation and the broader context of oppression. According to Gray, framing Hamas as a terrorist organisation oversimplifies the situation and ignores the underlying issues of occupation and displacement.
And I really hope that you specifically will believe women when they say that they got hurt.
All right, thanks for joining. Stick around, more Rising coming up next.
What Hamas has done to the women during the October 7th attack
Yeah, and unfortunately, we are very familiar with Zaka, but regrettably, the reporting has been roundly discredited by both Israeli and American media sources. So I really would like to bring this back to your sister specifically. And I want to ask you about what you make of new reports.
Because I saw the pictures.
Gray asserts that Hamas's actions should be understood in the context of resistance to occupation and the struggle for Palestinian self-determination. She argues that the group's actions are a response to the injustices faced by Palestinians rather than an inherent desire to commit acts of terror. Gray maintains that while violence is regrettable, it should be seen as part of the broader struggle against an occupying force. She emphasizes that this perspective considers the historical and political dimensions of the conflict rather than focusing solely on the actions of one group. Douglas Murray responds to Gray's arguments by accusing her of ignorance and moral bankruptcy. He argues that her support for Hamas reflects a failure to recognize the true nature of the group and its charter. Murray believes that Gray's position disregards the reality of Hamas's actions and the suffering they cause. He also accuses her of hypocrisy, pointing out that she criticizes the United States for its support of Israel, but does not address the human rights abuses committed by Hamas.
I'm Douglas Murray, and it's a great pleasure to have been asked to join you this evening. I wanted to just mention a few things in the short time I have. First is just to mention this: I'm not Jewish myself. I happen to have not just some, but most of my best friends are Jews. But the reason I mention this is that all my adult life I've been surrounded by, or chosen to be surrounded by, Jews. And why should that be? In my secular moments, I'd say it's been luck or good fortune. In my more religious moments, I'd say it's a signal of God's grace, of the wild grace of God. Because for me, these friendships and what I've learned from them have been among the greatest blessings of my life. I've known Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews. I've known secular Jews, Orthodox Jews, ultra-Orthodox Jews, Chabadnik Jews, and even some Reform. All of these differences are of great importance to many of you and to all of the people who argue them. But they mattered not one jot to the terrorists who broke into Israel on Saturday. They didn't care whether they were killing secular Jews or religious Jews, voters for Likud or voters for Yesh Atid. They didn't care what the views were of the people they were killing, whether they were for or against recent judicial reforms in Israel, whether they were one of the few people who believe they don't know how to run the country, or whether they were one of the 8 million people who believe they do know how to run the country. All that the terrorists cared about was that their victims were Jews. And that was it. They had to be Jews. I once asked Jonathan Sacks in private what he thought it meant to be a Jew. And he replied quite characteristically by quoting someone else. Specifically, he quoted his friend, the late great philosopher Isaiah Berlin. He said, Douglas, Isaiah once answered this question when he was asked by saying, to be a Jew is to have a sense of history. And I looked at Jonathan, I knew there was something more. He tilted his head. And I said, well, what do you think? He said, I think Isaiah was almost right. And I said, so what's your answer? He said, to be a Jew is to have a sense of memory. Now, memory can be a burden. For some people, an almost impossible burden. But it's also a blessing. Because if you as a people, you as individuals know what went before, You know that the Jewish people have been here many times before.
Murray argues that supporting Hamas, despite its charter and actions, is morally questionable. He suggests that Gray's position ignores the suffering of Israeli civilians and the broader implications of Hamas's terrorism. Murray asserts that her stance is a form of moral relativism that fails to adequately address the issues of terrorism and human rights. He believes that condemning violence and supporting human rights should be consistent, regardless of political or ideological affiliations. Brianna Joy Gray defends her position by framing Hamas as a legitimate resistance movement. She argues that the group's actions are a response to the Israeli occupation and that labeling them as terrorists fails to address the root causes of the conflict. Gray maintains that Hamas's struggle is part of a broader resistance to occupation and oppression, and it should be viewed within this context. Gray also accuses Douglas Murray of bias and a lack of understanding of the Palestinian perspective. She argues that Murray's view fails to consider the historical and political context that drives the conflict. According to Gray, the focus should be on addressing the root causes of violence, such as the occupation and displacement of Palestinians, rather than solely condemning the actions of one group. The debate also touches on the broader issue of critical race theory, CRT, and its impact on academic and social discourse. Douglas Murray criticises CRT for its focus on race and its potential to promote division within society. He argues that CRT's emphasis on racial differences can exacerbate existing social divisions and hinder constructive dialogue. Murray believes that CRT's approach to race and identity might lead to increased polarisation rather than fostering understanding and unity.
The Western culture and values that brought forth Christianity in the founding documents are being called evil and racist.
I'm reminded of the tyranny of communist China, where your money is legally stolen and then used in government schools to indoctrinate children against their parents.
As long as you Marxists push your unconstitutional agenda on my child, she will not be returning back to Loudoun County schools.
Her child's not going to go back. She's going to pull her out. A heated scene in Loudoun County, Virginia, where hundreds of parents pushed back against the school board over their woke agenda.
Yeah, we've been talking about this, but also we're seeing a lot of this. Author Douglas Murray is here to react. Douglas, what's your view of what's happening right now in America? One of the symptoms of the pandemic is parents saw what the kids were learning and they're reacting.
That's right. CRT, like a lot of the transgender ideology, is designed to divide. That's what it's meant to do. The transgender ideology stuff is, how dare you say that the big beefy guy can't enter the women's weightlifting competition and trounce all of the women? Who are you to say he shouldn't do that, you bigot? And the CRT agenda is a version of the same thing. It says, why can't we talk about problematizing whiteness? Who are you to object to that, you bigot? It's meant to divide. And so parents are right to call this out. They are right to say that you cannot talk about, for instance, white children as if they are a problem, any more than you should be able to talk about black children as if they're a problem. The people pushing this stuff have been trying to divide America. And it's absolutely right that American parents should take any opportunity they can to say, no, we will not allow you to do this.
So Brian interviewed some of the folks that were there at the meeting. Watch this, Douglas.
We are trying to recall the school board. 6 members out of 8 or 9 members we're trying to recall, because if we don't, these radical policies will not change.
Last night proved that this school board, and in particular Brenda Sheridan, have a real problem with the First Amendment, all the way from religious expression, freedom of conscience, to freedom of speech.
We do not want to co-parent with our government. We want to be able to instill beliefs and instill our faith in our children without hesitation. So they can mute our mics, they can arrest us, they can kick us off of public property. We're not going to stop.
Good for them for speaking up, Douglas, but what do you do? The school board has all the power.
Well, they have some power. They don't have all of it. And, God bless these parents for speaking up. Everybody has to use their voice about this stuff. The CRT agenda is not just intended to divide people. It's intended to demonize people.
Murray's critique of CRT centers on the idea that it reinforces racial divisions and undermines social cohesion. He argues that CRT's focus on systemic racism and historical injustices might contribute to a culture of grievance and victimhood. Murray suggests that this can be counterproductive and might prevent meaningful progress toward addressing social issues. He believes that a more inclusive and less divisive approach to race and identity would be beneficial for societal harmony. Brianna Joy Gray does not address the issue of CRT during the debate. Her focus remains on the discussion about Hamas and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. As a result, the debate does not explore the implications of CRT in relation to the Israeli-Palestinian situation. Gray's arguments are centered on the legitimacy of Hamas's resistance and the broader context of occupation, rather than engaging with the critique of CRT.
The story is false. The New York Times now appears to be trying to whitewash its complicity in spreading mass rape propaganda by citing other outlets, including the AP, CNN, and the Washington Post, as examples of outlets who also repeated the false account of this unnamed paramedic. But shared guilt is not absolution. Outlets including Electronic Intifada, The Gray Zone, The Intercept, and Mondoweiss debunked this source and other flimsy citations in the mass rape story weeks or even months ago. For example, back on March 4th, The Intercept reported that a spokesperson at Kibbutz Be'eri said the two girls shot were, quote, not subjected to sexual abuse. Of the paramedics' claims about the girls, the spokesperson told The Intercept back then, quote, it's not true. And get this, when The Intercept reached out to the Times for comment on that story, again in early March, Times spokesperson Danielle Rhodes-Ha told The Intercept, we stand by the story and are continuing to report on the issue of sexual violence on October 7th. Apparently now they've decided to report the truth long after it's been covered by independent journalists who bothered to do the work of vetting the original reporting's flimsy evidence. As for their original story, don't hold your breath for a retraction. They've simply added a bracketed addendum to the paramedic's testimony saying that new evidence undercuts his account. An incredible understatement and, frankly, a mockery of journalistic standards. Don't forget what the original Times story alleged. It claimed that a paramedic had found the bodies of two teenage girls in a room in Be'eri. One was lying on her side, boxer shorts ripped, bruises by her groin. The other was sprawled on the floor, face down, he said, pajama pants pulled to her knees, bottom exposed, semen smeared on her back. In contrast to all that detail, when the Times followed up with the paramedic to see if he still stood by that account, he declined to say and said he'd like to put the attacks behind him. Later, an Israeli military spokesman told the Times, quote, the medic stood by his testimony but might have misremembered the place he saw the teenage girls. I see. He misremembered a mass rape scene. Pajamas.
Overall, the debate provides a comprehensive overview of differing viewpoints on Hamas and its charter. Douglas Murray's perspective emphasizes the terrorist nature of Hamas, supported by the charter's content and the group's actions. He argues for a clear distinction between terrorism and resistance, highlighting the need to address terrorism and human rights abuses.